And welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be taking a look at the match played between Magnus Carlsen and Shakira Mamedyarov in the 7th and final round of the Oslo Esports Cup. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump right into the game. So Magnus, as we know, leading the event going into this final match. So first game, Shakira playing with the white pieces, and he chooses to play the move d4. Now Magnus replies with the move knight to f6. c4 is played here, and now Magnus plays g6. Now obviously a little bit surprising that Magnus chooses to play either the King's Indian or the Grunfeld defense here, but I think once again, based on the tournament situation with a couple players right behind him, he wanted to be more aggressive at the start here. So now we get knight to f3, and Magnus goes bishop g7 here, choosing not to play d5. Shakira plays e3 here, and the main idea behind playing this e3 move is that basically if black ever plays this move d5 trying to get back into a Grunfeld, white can always trade on d5, and unlike variations where there's a knight on c3 here, because there's no knight, white can now play e4 and take full control of the center. So for example, if we go back to this position and white plays knight c3 after d5, pawn takes, knight takes, whenever white plays e4 to put the pawns in the center, black is always able to trade the knight off on d5 for the knight on c3 here. So by playing e3, white basically prevents black from playing this move d5 and being able to trade knights on c3. Magnus castles, and now bishop to e2 is played here by Shaq. Now once again, if black plays d5 after pawn takes, knight takes, because white has not developed the knight to c3, white can simply play e4, taking control of the center once again. And after the knight moves back to, let's just say, f6, after knight c3, white has a perfect compact center here with pawns on d4 and e4. All right, so here Magnus plays c5. Now in this position, Shakira plays something very interesting. He chooses to play d takes c5. Now in the past, I myself have actually played this line with e3 and bishop e2 as white, and whenever I've had this position, I always play d5 here. I've had several games against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and several other players as well where I've played this d5 e6 knight c3 trade d6, and then you end up in a Benoni. I also had this against Anish Giri in one of the Meltwater events last year. However, Shaq chooses to play d takes c5. Magnus now plays knight a6, and Shaq castles. My assumption is that by taking on c5, Shaq basically decided he did not want to play d5 and play a Benoni. So now we get knight takes c5 here, which allows white to play b4. Now initially you're probably like, wait a second, this opens up this long diagonal from the bishop towards the rook on a1. However, if black plays knight fe4 here, white is able to prevent black from capturing the rook by moving the knight to d4. So Magnus goes knight ce4 instead. Shakira plays bishop b2, developing the bishop from c1 and also preventing black from being able to attack on this diagonal towards the rook on a1. So b6 is played by Magnus. Once again, the issue for black here is that he has not developed the bishop on c8 or the rook on a8, and black has to decide, does he want to go d6 and try to go bishop g4 or f5, or does he want to go b6 and fianchetto the bishop on the long diagonal? So Magnus chooses to play b6. Knight to b to d2 is played here by Shakriar. Bishop b7, knight takes knight. Magnus trades back, and now after bishop g7, king g7, we get queen d4 check, attacking both the king and the knight. Magnus retreats with the knight, and now we have rook fd1. Now this is probably the first very critical position of the game, because after rook fd1, it looks like white has a slight advantage in terms of development, a little bit more control of the center as well here, and of course the queen on d4, keeping an eye on the knight on f6 and potentially the king on g7. And in this position, Magnus makes a mistake here. Now Magnus is generally very precise in middle games, but here he makes what I would perceive as just a slight overlooking something very simple and just miscalculating, or perhaps he was just tired and didn't see what the difference was between the two moves in the game, whether he plays queen c7 or whether he plays d6 first. However, after queen c7, this is a very serious mistake, because now white can play his move knight to e5 here, attacking the pawn on d7. And now after after rook fd8 is played here, white can play knight g4. It's worth noting that if d6 is played, again, you can go knight g4 as well. So because the pawn is under attack here, black has to be very, very careful. Now the computer, of course, suggests that black can just play the very simple and obvious move, pawn to h5 here. The simple idea is stopping knight g4, and now if white captures on d7 after rook d8, white will be losing material, either the knight on d7 or the queen on d4. Again, very obvious move for a computer, but for a human, certainly not something that you would consider. Now once again, the only reason that h5 is a very good move is it stops this knight g4 idea. because after rook fd8, which is played in the game, now white can go knight g4, and black has some problems because what's happening here is I'm going to trade the knights on f6, and once you play, let's just say a random move like rook b8 for example, after trade, and even queen d6 here, your pawns are double on the f file, and you have this permanent weakness with the backwards pawn on d7 here. So black is already in a little bit of trouble. So here Magnus plays a5, Hikaru trades of course on f6, and now we get the situation where black has double pawns and this weakness on d7. So here Shaq plays queen d6. Now this is probably not the best move here. Computer actually thinks that after a3, if black tries to trade on b4 and play rook a1 here, after rook to a1 and d5, which I suspect was the idea that Magnus had, after rook a7, white is actually winning, because if black takes on c4 here, there's a very nice tactic with rook b7. If you go rook takes d4, rook takes c7, white just has an extra bishop. And if you play queen takes rook, I just go queen takes rook, and once again I still have an extra bishop on the board. Now I don't know if Magnus saw this, or sorry, not if Magnus saw this, but if Hikaru saw these ideas or not, but he chose not to play a3. Had he played a3, Magnus probably would have had to play something like d6, and after say h3 followed by rook c1. White is definitely better. Whether that's enough to win remains in doubt, but it's very easy to play. However, Shaq chooses to play queen d6, and now after trades, pawn takes b4, rook b6, bishop c6. White ends up a pawn here with an outside a pawn, but it's not really all that much because black can double up the rooks on the a file, and again bishop on c6 sort of keeps an eye on the pawn getting to a4 and a5, as well as the pawn on g2, and now this weakness on d7 really isn't all that much of a weakness. So Magnus plays rook a5 here. Bishop d1 is played by Shaq. Idea to put the bishop on b3, guard both the pawns on c4 and a2. Rook d8 is played, and now we get a4. Perhaps bishop b3 is a little bit easier to play, but once again, after a move like, I'm not even sure d5 is the best move, but after d5 takes an a4, let's just say black plays rook a5. White is up an a pawn here, and sure, you have a rook behind the passed pawn, but it's not really clear whether this is enough to win, and I suspect that with perfect play this would have been a draw. So Shaq chooses not to do that. Instead he plays a4, and the idea behind a4 is very simple. Sure, the pawn is attacked by both rooks and the bishop here, but black no longer is a way to force a rook and pawn endgame, whereas in this line with bishop b3, you'll notice that bishops are always coming off the board, and so Shaq decides, even though this a4 pawn is always a weakness, the bishops are never getting traded here. Let's say black goes d5 and trades. Unless white wants to trade with bishop b3 or bishop f3, the bishops will remain on the board. So king to f8 is played here by by Magnus. Now you get f3, king to e7. The idea is very simple. It is an endgame, and you can activate this king and bring it into the game. So you get bishop b3 played here. Now we get h5. Important move, by the way, because after a move like king d6 here, white can maybe now try something like c5, and after king takes c5, there might be something like rook h4 or even rook f4. And in both of these cases, the pawns are very, very loose here, and it's not really clear whether black can save the game. In fact, computer gives white a fairly significant advantage. So after bishop b3, Magnus starts with h5, basically avoiding any of these long-term threats with rook h4 towards the pawn in h7. King f2 is played. Now we get rook to c5 played by Magnus, e4, and now f5, eliminating the double pawns here. Very important move here. At this point in time, the pawns are still doubled, but after e4 f5, now you're getting rid of the double pawns, and black should be able to draw this pretty easily. So now we get pawn takes, rook d1. Magnus goes back to a5, and now we get this move rook b5 being played here. Idea that basically after bishop takes, white can take with the c pawn. Two connected, and white tries to claim that he has chances. Unfortunately here, black can play the very simple move rook takes a4, bishop takes a4, rook takes a4, sacrificing back the rook for the bishop, but creating a rook and pawn endgame where both sides have the same number of pawns. And now we get rook b1, king d8. King is just in time here to get over before white can push the pawn and force the rook to have to go back to prevent it from queening. b6, king to c8, rook to c1 check, king b7 is played, and now we get this move rook to c7, king takes b6, rook takes d7, and now Magnus finds the critical move rook to f4. Rook a7 would actually probably be losing here, because after trades, white can now bring this king in, and after king b6, king to e4, king c6, king e5, king d7, king f6, king e8. I believe that white should be winning here if he plays f4, king f8, f5, and after takes, white will be able to bring the king over, capture the h pawn, and he will be winning with 2 pawns versus 1. So Magnus correctly plays rook f4 here, guarding the pawn on f7. We get king to g3. rook f5, and now again white has no way to remove the rook from f5 where it's guarding the pawn at f7, and Shaq admits that he can no longer win. He plays rook d4, king c5, rook to f4, trades, and now Magnus finds the one really important move. Maybe king d6 is drawing as well, but he goes pawn to f6, and now the white king can no longer enter. All these squares are covered. The pawn on f6 covers e5 and g5, and the pawn on g6 covers the f5 square here. Shaq plays g4, they trade, king d5, h4, king e6, and even though Shaq is able to get an outside pass pawn, it is the only pawn on the board, being the h pawn, so it's an easy draw. Pawn takes, king f7, king f5, king g7, h6, and now king h6, king f6, and the game ends in a draw. Very exciting first game. Shaq clearly was better for most of the game. He was the only player who had chances to win, but Magnus showed some very good defense when he needed to, and he's able to save the game. So let's move on to the second game now, where Magnus is playing with the white pieces. So we get pawn to c4, e5 played by Shaq, and Magnus plays knight c3, continuing to play the English opening which he played in previous matches against Jordan Van Forest and several others. So knight c3 is played, and now we get bishop to b4, knight to d5, bishop e7, knight f3, d6. Now this is a very common line, this bishop b4 e7 line. In fact, I myself had a lot of games against Vishy Anand in this exact line, and it's very, very sharp, very complicated. The computer almost always gives white a small advantage, but black generally can equalize with precise play. So we get d4, knight to f6 being played here, and now we get knight takes e7, queen takes e7. Now white has the bishop pair, the two ops on c1 and f1. Black only has a bishop here. However, black has a very, very solid center here with these pawns from c7 to e5, and maybe black can even push the pawn to e4 depending on the circumstances. So we get e3 played by Magnus, trying to develop the light square bishop. E takes d4 is played by Shaq, knight takes, and now castles, bishop e2, and rook d8. One thing that's really important here is that white is a little bit behind in development. He is not castled yet, and it's also going to take time to develop the queen side, like b3, bishop b2, and other moves. So Shaq has a very clear idea in mind of trying to open up the center as fast as possible here. So we get castles, now c5, attacking the knight on d4, knight to f3, knight to c6. Again, black could play d5 first, but there's no need to be hasty, and you can continue to develop. So now we get knight c6, bishop d2 is played here by Magnus, and now d5, opening up the center, pawn takes, and now rook takes d5. Now again, two bishops in the long term, especially in endgames, can be better than a bishop and a knight, but in this specific situation, because the d file is open and the bishops don't really have great diagonals here, and black can even go knight e4 to attack the dark square bishop, black is probably slightly better already. Again, you look at the light square bishop, not really a lot happening on this diagonal. Dark square bishop can get to c3, maybe long term some threats towards the knight on f6 and the pawn on g7, but again, black can always go knight e4. So you play queen c1, knight e4, you cannot really position the bishop on the diagonal. So Magnus chooses to go queen b3, and now Shaq plays bishop e6 here. Magnus plays bishop c3, basically inviting black to move the rook somewhere to create a discovered attack on the queen, but it doesn't really do anything special. If you play a move like rook to d2, for example, white goes bishop c4, blocking the threats. After trades, now white is clearly better because the bishop is perfectly placed on c3, and there's also a weakness with the pawn on c5 here, so the bishop on c3 is incredible, and white has an advantage. Shaq plays knight to e4, very logical move. Now Magnus goes bishop c4, and Shaq plays rook d6, and now white is going to lose the bishop pair here. White will be forced to trade some bishops off the board, and so therefore black is probably slightly better, especially with this knight on e4 that's perfectly placed, targets the bishop on c3, targets the pawn on f2, and maybe even prevents white from playing a move like knight to d2. So now we get bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, rook a d1, and now Shaq plays h6. Now it's important to note that the bishop on c3 looks very nice because it's eyeing the pawn on g7 here. However, the knight on e4 can always capture it at any moment. So now we get pawn to a4, pawn to b6 is played here by Shaq. Magnus goes h3, and now we get knight takes c3. Now my assumption is that at this point Shaq felt he had completed his development. He didn't really think there was a whole lot more he could do here. For example, he can maybe play rook d8, maybe he can go rook e8, but I suspect that after this h3 move, he didn't really feel like there was a better way to improve the position. So now he decides to trade, and now Magnus plays a very interesting move. He takes here with the pawn. Now white can also take with the queen here. I suspect the reason Magnus did not do this is that after a move like rook d8 followed by rook d6, black is going to take control of the open d file here, And additionally, there's maybe even a move like knight b4 with this outpost here, and it feels quite scary for white. So Magnus chooses to take with the pawn, and the idea is that now basically after rook d8 you trade, you can play rook d1, and even though black gets control of the d file here, it's only with the queen, and there's now no outpost on b4 or d4, so white should be able to stabilize and draw this game. So here Magnus plays queen c2, Shaq goes g6, just creating more lift for the king on g7. We get queen to e4, king to g7, and now Magnus goes g3 with the idea of playing king g2. Again, just trying to slowly improve his position. Not a whole lot is happening here, but black still can claim maybe a very slight advantage because he has a 3-on-2 on the queen side here, 3 versus 2, and additionally the white pawns are split. They're one file apart. So a6 is played here by Shaq, queen to b1 by Magnus, and now we get knight to e7, redeploying the knight, trying to get to d5 where it can target the pawn on c3 and maybe the pawn on e3 as well. Magnus plays c4, again trying to prevent b5, create a permanent weakness of the pawn on b6, and maybe long-term reroute this knight from f3 to a better square. So now we get knight g8, queen to b2, and now Shaq plays queen f6, a very interesting move here, trying to force a trade of the queens. So Magnus chooses to trade, and now after knight f6 this should be a draw, primarily because the pawns on c4 and a4, while they look a little bit weak after white plays a move like knight to 2 for example, the pawn on c4 and the pawn on a4 aren't really weaknesses, and black cannot really create a pass pawn easily. For example, say you get the absolute maximum here, which is a king on c6 for example, you'll notice that even a position like this, in this position here, black has a pass pawn, but with the king so close and the knight able to go to like c3 or d2, black really has no winning chances. However, Magnus plays an interesting move here. He chooses instead to play knight e5, trying to bring the knight towards the center. We get king to f8, goes f3, trying to prevent knight e4 here, taking away space from the dark square knight, or from the black knight, which can't move to e4 or d5. Also can't go to d7 either because the knight covers that square. So now we get king to e7, Magnus goes king f2, king e6, knight d3, and here Shaq plays knight e8. Very interesting move played by Shaq, trying to bait white into making a mistake. Now, as we've said many times, Magnus is very clearly the most prominent endgame player in the world, even now, and even if you look at the past. He's definitely somebody who's had a great track record, wins more endgames than anyone else, considered to be the strongest point of his game. Magnus, in uncharacteristic fashion, however, chooses to play this move a5 here, which is a very big mistake. Now, I'm not exactly sure why Magnus played this move, because as I look at the position, it seems like it's just a very clear blunder. My assumption is that for whatever reason, Magnus simply missed it after pawn takes, knight takes, that he could not capture this pawn on a6. Now, once again, as we look at this position, it is of course a knight and pawn endgame. Black wants to go b5, but white can always bring the king closer, and after a move like king e2 for example, say black plays knight d6, now after knight f4, king d7, king d3, again black can't really create a pass pawn if you ever go b5. Best case scenario is this, but with the king so close to the pawn on c5, white really should not be in any danger here. So very uncharacteristically, Magnus in this position plays a5, which is a very big mistake, because after pawn takes, knight takes, king d6, you're like, well, what's going on here? It looks like white is going to end up a pawn here. There's knight a6 and knight b7. But first of all, if you play knight takes a6 here, you're actually close to loss because black can go knight f6, and your knight is stuck in this little box here. You really have no squares that you can move to. And after say a move like king e2, I now go king c6. Say you go king d3, I can now go king b6, attacking the knight. No squares available. b4, c5, c7, all three squares. There is a capture. So knight b8 is the only move. But after knight b8, I can now go king b7, and your knight is once again trapped because the knight on f6 covers d7, and if you go to c6 or a6, the king will capture, or I will just capture your knight on b8. So you can't capture the pawn on a6. Now knight b7 is another move, and perhaps Magnus saw this and he just miscalculated the line that results after king c6, knight takes a5, and now the very important move king c5, because now after king e2, I can go king b4 here, attacking both the knight and the pawn. And after knight c6, king c4, if you play a move like knight e5 here, after king b3, knight takes f7, a5, this a pawn is very fast. It's rolling down the board in a hurry. Computer still only says it's about -1 in favor of black, but for a human, and especially in a blitz or rapid game, it feels really, really scary with this pawn marching straight down the board, and you can only really hope that your knight on f7 can get back in time. So Magnus chooses to play knight a4 here, Now again, on first glance you're like, well, white's probably better. It's even material, but white doesn't have any double pawns like these pawns in a6 and a5. But in the end game, this is a very far outside pawn here, and so in fact black is probably close to winning. Knight c7 is played by Shaq, e4, and now we get knight e6, king e3, knight to c5. And this is the big problem here, is that if white ever trades knights, black is winning because even though the pawns are doubled, they're outside pass pawns on the edge of the board, and black will be able to flank here after king b3, a2 takes. Say you go king b2, king d3, black is just going to go king e3 and gobble all of these pawns on the king side, and white still has to be preoccupied with this a pawn, which can march all the way down the board. So after knight c5, Magnus plays the move e5 check, attacking the king. Shaq of course plays king c6, does not eat the pawn because then you lose your knight. So king c6 is played, knight c3, and now as the great famous American grandmaster Yasser Seirawan would say, when you have passed pawns, push baby push. So he goes to a4. Now f4 is played by Magnus, a3, pawn to g4. Magnus here, the one thing he is trying to do is he's trying to trade off pawns on the king side here so that these double pawns aren't really a factor. If white is ever able to, say for example, trade off all these pawns, he will be able to make a very easy draw here with something like this, king d2, king c2, king b1, and he will be able to draw the game. So white would love to trade off all the kingside pawns if possible, and the idea is simply f5 and maybe e6 as well. So here Shaq plays knight e6, which is an interesting choice. f5 played by Magnus, pawn takes, and now he goes knight g7, attacking the pawn on f5. And if white tries to go king e4, for example, now black will go king c5, and you have a lot of problems here with your knight on c3 being weak. Pawns can't really advance any further because the knight on g7 covers both f5 and both the f5 square and the e6 square. So Magnus goes f6, knight to e6, blockading. Now white can no longer push the pawn to e6 and create a passed pawn on the f file. King to d3, king to d7 played, and now here Magnus plays h4. King d7 is an interesting move. King c5 seems more intuitive to a human, but after king c5, white can maybe go king c2, takes, and maybe there's some idea like knight e4 with some counterplay featuring knight to d6 at some point. Computer seems to hate this, but it is an idea here. And the computer says king d5, knight d6, knight d8 is winning, but again, limited time, tough position to play. Not surprising that Shaq doesn't find this. So he goes king d7 here, h4, h5, king to e4 being played. So Magnus decides that he's going to try to stop the a pawn with the knight, and hopefully he'll be able to keep the king somewhere in the center here and bring it into like d5 or f5 down the road. King c6 is played, king d3, and now Shaq plays a5. No reason not to start pushing the pawns here. King c2, now he goes knight d4, king b1, and now he finds king d7. Now apparently this is not actually the best way to play the position, but again with limited time, seeing knight f3, the idea to capture the pawn and create another pass pawn and have the wide peepos on the a file and the h file running down the board, it makes a lot of sense. So Magnus plays knight e4 here, knight to f3, attacking both the pawns on h4 and e5. We get knight to g3, which is a very big blunder because now black can play knight d2, creating the fork of the king and the pawn. And after king a2, knight takes c4, knight takes h5. Now black goes king e6, and the main problem here is that the knight on c4 always guards the pawn on a3. If you go king b3, for example, after king takes e5, you still cannot capture the knight because then I make a new queen. And in the meantime, your knight on h5 is kind of out of play, and you're not going to be able to push this h pawn up the board very quickly. So you got knight to f4, king takes e5, knight to d3, king takes f6, king b3 played here by Magnus, again trying to create something. He could have tried to go knight c1 first, but again after a4, this is simply losing. a4 important move, by the way, because say you go king g7, king b3. Now I am threatening to capture the knight because say you go f5 takes, knight prevents the pawn from moving to a2. So if you have to move the knight, then I capture the pawn, and maybe I can sack my knight for this f pawn. Your a5 pawn is also very weak, and there are very good drawing chances. However, Magnus plays king b3 first. Again, it's worth noting knight c1 a4 just stops king b3 altogether, so this would be winning as well. And after king b3, Shaq plays a4. Very nice move, attacking the king. King actually can only go to a2 if you capture. a2 wins. If you capture, a2 wins. King b4, a2. And if you go anywhere on the c file like c2 or c3, I can still go a2 because the knight covers the b2 square, and I'm going to make a queen anyway. So you get king a2 being played here by Magnus. Now we get king g6, knight c5, and now king h5. And after knight takes a4, to his credit, Shaq does not capture the pawn on h4. It's not really a problem here. Instead, he starts pushing the f-pawn up the board, and now with the wide p-pose, this is a very easy win for black, because after knight c3, you go f4, king b3, and the very important move, pawn to f3 here. And now white can no longer capture the knight on c4, because after f2 I make a queen. And if you go knight to e4 or d1 for that matter, both are playable. I just gobble on h4 anyway, and you cannot capture the knight because then my pawn rolls, and the knight still has to stay on e4 to prevent the f pawn. And so a sample line would be king a2, king h3, king b3, king g2, and after king a2, f2. This is simply winning for black because you have to sack the knight. King cannot capture the knight because the pawn goes, so you go king a2, king d4, king b3, king c5, king a2, king b4, and now after king a1 you go king b3, king b1, knight e3, king a1, knight c2, king b1, a2, king c1, and now you just go a1 queen, king d2, check, and mate. So in this position, after this move f3, Magnus resigns the second game, and he falls behind in this match by a score of 1.5 to half. So let's go to the third game now, being played between Shaq and Magnus. Now of course, losing with white, very difficult in the second match, though it is a best of 4, so Magnus would have 2 chances to strike back. But coming off this very shocking loss, in the third game he has to defend with the black pieces. So the game starts out with d4, knight to f6 is played here, c4, g6, and now Shaq plays knight c3, offering Magnus the opportunity to go into the Grunfeld. Now this is quite a bit of psychology and gamesmanship from Hikaru, because Magnus obviously in the first game was fine playing the Grunfeld because he felt that it's very solid and a draw is okay. However, after losing the second game, if Magnus plays the Grunfeld, it's not really clear what Hikaru would have done, but my assumption is he would have found one of many lines where there was a forced draw here with the white pieces, and Magnus felt that he needed to try and win this game. He didn't want to go into one of those lines, so he plays this move bishop g7. Again, a draw, obviously not a great result here with him trailing in the match. So bishop g7 is played, Shaq plays g3, trying to play the fianchetto variation against this king's Indian setup. So now we get c5, pawn takes, queen a5, bishop g2 being played here. Again, if white tries to hang on to the pawn here with a move like bishop e3, after knight to e4, white is in a lot of trouble here with the pin of the knight on c3 from the queen on a5. Black has a knight and the bishop and the queen all attacking towards the this white king on e1. So bishop g2 is played, Magnus captures the pawn, and now we get bishop d2. Queen b3 is also another move that is played here. I don't remember the exact evaluation of what's going on. Having studied this maybe about a decade ago, I do recall that queen b3 was considered quite dangerous, but time and theory both move on in the great game of chess. So we get bishop d2 played here, and now Magnus castles. Again, he does not capture on c4 because this would actually be a serious blunder. White can go knight to d5 here. If you play knight takes knight, now I go rook c1, targeting the bishop and the queen. If you move the queen, oopsie daisies, checkmate, game over. Your king is in check, so you cannot castle here. That would violate the rules of chess. And if black plays a move like knight c3, I can still just capture, and you're in a lot of trouble. If you castle, I just take, and I'm fossilizing the queen again. If you try check, I just come back and block, and I'm winning because I have an extra bishop. So you can't really castle. And again, if you trade on c3, now you have the same problem with the queen on c4 under attack and the bishop on c8 under attack as well. So Magnus chooses to castle here. We get this move rook c1, now queen c4, knight d5 again would be winning, pawn on e7 is weak. There's also knight c7 to capture the rook in the corner, and this is just simply GG's. So d6 is played. Now we get b3 to guard the pawn on c4. Knight c6 is played here. Knight f3. White tries to finish this development on the king side, and so here Magnus plays the move queen to h5, and now we get this important move h3. White does not castle here because generally when you play fianchetto setups with the bishop on g2 or g7 for that matter, when your opponent tries to exchange a bishop, whether it be h6, whether it be h3, you really don't want to exchange this light square bishop because it's really nice on this long diagonal. Now the same thing applies for black. For example, say we get some position like this for example, white's trying to go bishop a6 and trade the bishops. A lot of times what you'll try to do in such positions is go a move like rook e8, bishop h6, and try to go bishop h8 to keep the bishop alive on the long diagonal. So after queen h5, h3 is played. Hikaru does not castle. Instead, he basically prevents black from moving the bishop to h3. Additionally, down the road, white can maybe even go g4 and make this queen feel very unpleasant on h5. So h6 is played here by Magnus. Now Hikaru plays g4. Queen to c5 is played by Magnus. I probably would have gone queen a5 here, and after knight d5 something like queen d8, maybe queen a3. It feels bad for white, but or for black I should say, but maybe there's some chances. After queen c5 it just feels like this queen is a little bit loose here. There's a move like knight a4, maybe knight d5 down the road, and it feels very hard to play. So bishop e3 is played by Chakra. Queen a5. Now we get queen d2, blocking this pin from a5 towards the king on e1, additionally attacking the pawn on h6 as well. So now we get h5 played here, not king h7 by the way, because now white can maybe even play something like g5, takes, knight takes, king g8, and something like knight d5, and maybe white's not actually better here, but it still feels kind of scary to play. So instead h5 is played. Now we get g5 being played by Chakra. We get knight to d7 by Magnus, trying to reroute the knight either to e5 or to c5. Knight d5 is played here. Magnus chooses to go queen d8. Queen takes d2 would have been preferable, but after bishop takes d2 with this great connect 4 in the center of the board, great knight on d5 targeting the pawn on e7, knight c7 ideas, it feels kind of hard to play. And with Magnus being down in the match 1.5, he obviously did not want to be on a slightly worse end game, because if he loses it's over, and even if he somehow draws, it's going to be a long game of suffering. So he chooses to keep queens on the board with queen d8. Now we get knight to d4, knight to c5 is played here, and now Shaq trades and goes knight to b4. And at this point it's feeling really bad for black. The pawn on c6 is under attack. There's this long diagonal, a lot of problems here potentially with this weak pawn. You also are going to be gambiting it here. There's no way to save it, because no matter how you protect it, white will be attacking it with the knight and the bishop. So Magnus plays queen c7, bishop takes c6 is played, and he goes rook b8. Now bishop g2 is played by Chakra, and at this point Magnus is completely lost here. White is simply up a pawn here, and he has an outpost on d5, maybe c6 as well. Black really doesn't have any threats. Open dark square diagonal, no real threats on the king side either. Not even f6 is really an idea, because again knight d5 or knight c6, and so Magnus is in really bad shape. So he plays a5 here, knight d5, queen to a7 being played here, and now white just castles. And like I said before, white is simply up a pawn here and has no real weaknesses. Maybe h3 is a very slight weakness, but with this great knight on d5 attacking the pawn on e7, black can never really claim that he has any counterplay. Also, if black tries to play e6 kicking the knight, I now go knight f6 check. d6 is super weak, so if you go king h8 queen d6, you simply resign the game. And if you try to trade on f6, now you have problems on your dark squares as well, where maybe I can do something like bishop c5, queen c5, queen h6, and again I create the classic Jean-Baptiste Lully checkmate, which was named after the famous Italian chess player from the 1700s. So Magnus is in really bad shape. So he plays bishop e6 here, and now we get rook f d1. Chakra taking no risk, just consolidating the position here and playing like a rock. Bishop takes d5 is played. He takes with the pawn, and now Magnus plays rook b4. Idea very simply, try and activate the rook. Maybe rook b8 is an idea, maybe a4, desperately grasping to try and get some counterplay. So you get rook c2 being played here. Very calm move, with the idea of playing rook c1 to try and win material on the c file. Rook c8 is played, and now we get rook dc1, creating the double stack, keeping an eye on this knight on c5. Bishop e5 is played here, and now rook c4. Fantastic move, I have to say, by Shaq, taking it very slow, just trying to improve offer trades. He is up a pawn here, in addition to just having an overwhelming position, so there's no need to rush it, and you can just slowly keep on building. So queen b6 is played here by Magnus. We get rook takes b4. Now this move I don't actually like all that much, I have to say. I feel like white could probably improve. I'm not really sure what the best way to improve is for white, but it feels like this is a little bit unnecessary, because after a takes b4, black will at least get this bishop on c3, where it's going to be protected by a pawn on b4, and maybe this becomes a strength. Of course, in reality it's not that big of a deal, but maybe there was some way to prevent this. So you get rook c4 here, attacking the pawn on b4. Bishop c3 guards the pawn, attacks the queen. Queen c2, queen a5, and now here Chakra plays an interesting move. He plays this move bishop e4 with the idea of trying to attack on the king side. Now if black plays, let's just say, a random move like queen a6, after bishop takes g6, pawn takes g6, queen g6, if black plays a move like bishop g7, white can simply take because of the pin, or even play a move like bishop d4, which also is completely winning as well. So king h7 is played by Magnus to guard the pawn on g6. Now we get bishop f3 here, creating a threat of capturing the pawn because of the pin from c2 to h7. King G8 played again, bishop E4, King H7, bishop F3, King G8, and now Shaq plays King G2. Now in the old European school of chess, one thing that you were taught very frequently is that if there is a repetition, you take it. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, usually in classical games of chess, there's a 40 move rule, so you want to get one move closer to the time control. The second reason is that generally you want to repeat the position and then think after that, because you're going to be a little bit fresher there. So also the third thing that I will add is this also kind of sometimes gives your opponent this false sense of hope where they think they might be getting a draw, and then just like that you play a different move and you crush those hopes, and psychologically if they were ready for the draw, ready to end the game peacefully, it's not ending and the show goes on. So now we get rook a8 being played here by Magnus, trying to capture the pawn on a2. Now this I think is probably the critical blunder. It doesn't lose the game on the spot, but now after takes in d6 it feels really hard to play for black. So we get pawn takes pawn, bishop takes rook, queen takes, and even though the advantage hasn't gone up materially for white in this position, it's actually a lot easier, I feel, for white to play, because now with only the bishop and the queen, white just has to be careful and prevent any real threats towards the king, especially something like queen c1 after a move like queen d8 to target the pawn on g5. So we get king g1, pawn to d5, and now rook takes c5. And this actually is one thing that I will say is very bizarre in this position, is I don't know whether d5 was a mouse slip by Magnus or not. Queen d5 seems like the obvious choice here to try and target the pawn on g5, but even after h4 followed by either e4 or queen e4, white has a significant advantage. I don't think the outcome of the game would have been any different. However, after this move d5, there's now rook takes c5, and Magnus is completely lost here. He goes d4, queen to d3, queen takes a2. You don't really need this a pawn because you're going for a nasty checkmate here with rook c8, king h7. And after queen f3, Magnus resigns the game, and with it he loses in the final match of the tournament. The queen on f3 is targeting f7. If you take on b3, I go queen f6, and I create the classic lobster pincer in the corner here. And if you don't take on b3, there isn't really much else you can do. If you go f5, I have queen b7 checkmate here. King can't go anywhere, and so Magnus loses this game. Now of course d5 I'm pretty sure was a mouse slip. It's just not a move that's characteristic of Magnus. He probably meant to go queen d5. Nonetheless, the mouse slips do catch up with him in this event. He loses a match to Jordan where I don't know if that was a mouse slip or outright blunder. He loses to Liem. That match featured some mouse slips, and he makes a very fatal mouse slip in this third and final game against Hikaru, and with it he loses the match. And he also does not win the Oslo Esports Cup. He finishes in third place, you guys. So as we look at the final standings after all the rounds are through, we end up with Jan Christos Duda, who wins the Oslo Esports Cup with 14 match points. Second place is Liem from Vietnam with 13, and Magnus ties for third with Pragnanta, both of them finishing with 12 match points. So a very shocking result, I have to say, for Magnus. Certainly not what you expect from him in this event. He's won every single event thus far in the Chess Champions Tour, but even if you're the best, sometimes you lose. And so a very shocking end to the tournament, but big congrats to Jan Christos Duda for winning, and hopefully for Magnus he can find a better mouse, avoid these mouse slips, because I do think that without these slips, in particular in the match against Liem, if he doesn't lose that match, he probably does win this tournament. So very tough for Magnus, but again, the show goes on, and we'll see if he can bounce back in the next tournament of the Chess Champions Tour.